Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Well, we have with us today someone who is going to look at political demographics here in the United States and worldwide. We'll take a look at that too, but more here in the United States. This gentleman, he's a retired journalist and a market researcher who's been tracking demographics of abortion for 25 years. He's the president of Movement for a Better America. And welcome, Dennis M. Howard.
Hi, Brendan. How are you doing?
Very well, Dennis. Dennis, I wanted to ask you, first of all, one of the things you in your website, and there's tremendous amounts of statistics and ratios and things of that nature, but you're predicting tough times for the Democrats over the next 40 years politically. Why is that?
Well, because the abortions have been, they've promoted abortion, but they have disproportionately impacted minority populations. And frankly, the current desperation of the Democrats reminds me of the guy falling past the 50th floor of the Empire State Building while reassuring himself so far so good. They don't realize how much this has hurt them. They've just never taken into account. They think they're doing a good thing for people, and in fact, there have been 62 million abortions, but I estimate that over 60% of them were Democrats. And that's reflected in the data. I have state-by-state data for abortion going all the way back to 1973 and earlier.
For instance, in the black population, what percentage roughly does of the black population votes Democratic?
Typically 90 to 95%. With Obama, they went up to 95%. With Bill Clinton, I think they were around 90%. And on top of that, some 60% of all abortions are black or Hispanic abortions. So it disproportionately affects their voting base. To lose a voting group, a substantial portion of a voting group that votes 90% your way is a huge impact. However, it takes place over a long period of time, and it's really only finally making a big difference in elections. And 2016 was the first election where I could say decisively that it made a difference. And 2020, the impact will be even greater, and it'll be greater in years beyond that.
Well, let me ask you about 2016. Trump was quote-unquote surprisingly elected. What happened? Can you look at it state by state? How did he do in various pro-life or pro-abortion states?
Yeah, well, people have to understand that 25 states only have 10% of all the abortions. And they're mainly Republican red states. The other 25 states have 90% of the abortions, and they're predominantly Democratic blue states. So they're hit disproportionately by the total number of abortions. And overall, Trump won 18 out of 21 states with low abortion rates, while Hillary won 11 out of 12 states with high abortion rates. And they split the 18 states with moderate abortion rates. So it's clear that abortion had something to do with the outcome.
May I ask you just for a second, we talked about the voting percentage of blacks being in the 90 to 95% range. What about Hispanics? How frequently do they vote Democratic versus Republican?
It varies a little state by state, but it's about 65% vote Democratic nationally.
And how many?
And there are other groups where you have that are impacted as well. Women, for example, tend to vote more Democratic, but it's not as high a percentage. That's more like 60%. But half of all abortions are women, so again, they're losing more voters than the Republicans are.
I see. And Say in some of these key states during the past election, like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania,
Yeah,
Florida.
well, that was a clincher because states like Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida switched from Obama in 2012 to Trump in 2016. And all of these had large minority populations and moderate abortion rates. They also had narrow pluralities for one part or the other. So it was easier for them to shift. States like New York and California, Massachusetts, and some others have much larger Democratic majorities, so it will take a lot longer for those states to be impacted in a big way, even though they're in the higher abortion group.
Well, what would you expect, say, in 2020 on the national election? How is abortion going to affect that election cycle?
Well, I think you'll have another 4 to 6 million missing voters on the Democratic side because of the cumulative impact. It's going up by at least 1 million a year.
What's going up? The number of missing votes?
The impact on voters. And you have to remember that you have to be 18 to vote. So the last 18 years of abortions have no impact on voting.
You mean the first 18 years of
No,
life?
the first 18, but demographically, the last 18 years. People born in the last 18 years are not voting yet.
Right.
So they will be voting, and they would have added 4 or 5 million more votes with each cycle. So you're going to have another dent.
You say so. Basically, the Democrats are going to lose another 4 or 5 million voters. Is that what you're alluding to?
Yeah. Well, their margin may drop by another 2 million. And you can see how in an election that's close, that will make a huge difference.
I see. Now, what is the long-term impact that we're talking about? You mentioned something called the echo effect. What is that, and what is the long-term impact of all these abortions?
Well, the echo effect is the impact on future births. So we've had 62 million abortions since 1967. That means we're going to have 62 million fewer babies over the next 30, 40 years. A lot of those would have been born already, so they're already in the data. But it's an echo effect that in fact doubles the impact of abortion alone. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it goes on from generation to generation. There's no way you're going to bring them back. We're headed for a long-term population decline. The United States has just hit its past the curve as far as population decline is concerned.
I see.
And it will also affect us economically because population growth is about half annual GDP growth. So where you have 3% GDP growth year to year, half of that is growth in population. So without population growth, you're going to have a decline in growth. It's interesting, for example, that Trump made a difference with a lot of the tax measures and reducing regulations. It was able to bump it up from about 1.5% year growth to close to 3%, in spite of the fact that the demographics are still there. But if you take away those measures, our growth rate will slip back to 1.5% and maybe even lower.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had an interesting comparison to put in perspective abortion versus lynching. The blacks in this country, when they get on television, they talk about the lynchings in the South. Can you give us what you found in relation to abortion and lynching?
Abortion has had far more serious impact than lynching ever did. There were fewer than 5,000 blacks lynched between the Civil War and 1968, when lynching pretty well fizzled out. By the way, there were also about 1,250 white lynchings that occurred in that period of time, too, so it wasn't exclusively black. But we've had 22 million black abortions. That's 4,400 times as many people as were lynched. It's a huge difference. Huge crime, big difference.
Major.
I mean, I'd have to.
Well, without abortion, what would be the black share of the economy?
The black share of the economy would be much bigger. I would guess for example, population-wise, without abortion, there would be at least 73 million blacks in this country. Today, there are only 43 million. And that includes, the difference is 22 million abortions plus the babies that would have already been born to those that were aborted. So there's roughly a 30 million gap. And the black economy would be 69% bigger if not for all those abortions. And it's so. It's wonderful that we're trying to do things to improve black unemployment and improve black economic status. But it's totally counterproductive to tolerate aborting babies and destroying black families. Senator Moynihan, hinted at this in his famous study back in the early 60s, and he saw what was coming, but it's gotten far worse. In effect, the black share of the economy would be close to 70% larger. And by the way, that also echoes into the future, because you can't bring back what you've lost. I mean, the Democrats may be able to go down to the local cemetery and pull out a few names of people who registered to vote and then died, but you can't bring back aborted babies.
Right, with 30 million. Well, you're saying between the 22 million aborted and the amount that would have been the next generation having children. Let me ask you then, worldwide, what are some of the countries where we have serious population declines?
Well, Russia is in a serious population decline. They've had abortion since 1928 as a national policy, and Russian women tend to look at abortion as their primary method of birth control. But they don't have enough women in their population to restore growth, and they're really going down and down.
Is it partially emigration out of Russia, or is it mostly?
No, not at all. When you realize, look at the Soviet Union during World War II, they were able to marshal huge armies and huge manufacturing. Starting from scratch, all because of the people they had, and of course they had, it was basically a police state and a slave state, so everybody had to work. But the resources they've managed to put together to defeat the Germans with help from us is remarkable. They couldn't do anything like that today.
And China?
China is headed off the cliff. I've predicted this for a number of years.
But didn't they just bump from 1 to 2 children? You can now have 2 children instead of just 1?
Yes, but I think you still need a permit to do that. However, the damage is done. There are something like 1 million or more young Chinese who will never be able to find a bride because of the difference in the number of female babies and male babies.
Right.
And the elderly population in China is about 40 million people who are just going to go, 300 or 400 million who are, going to be gone, and there's no way of replacing them. The birth rate currently is low. Not only that, once you have a policy like this for many, many years, people get used to it, and they're not going to go back to suddenly having, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids.
Well, how many children should we have? One or two, or should we have more? What would you say? What would be necessary to replenish the population here, or Europe, or China?
To restore, first of all, our average number of children per family has dropped in this country from over 3 to about 2, and the fertility rate for American women now is 1.8.
That's 1.8 children per woman in the country, and we need about 2.1, I believe. Is that correct?
That's for mere replacement. And it might be a little higher than that because more and more women, are not getting married or not having children at all. Mm-hmm. So that extra 0.1 is meant to make up for the ones who don't have children. Mm-hmm. So I would estimate if you wanted to restore growth, and I'm looking at it strictly from an economic point of view, you'd have to go back to at least an average of 3 children per family. And we have to understand, I mean, I've had, 10 kids in my life, and, I've lost 3, 2 in the last year. And not everybody lives to a ripe old age.
Right.
I'm fortunate in that respect. But,
well, let me ask you this:
something like 20% of the people don't even make it to collect Social Security.
Yeah, well, that's
so they're paying in, but they're not.
Right,
they get the $250 death benefit, but they're not. They don't get to collect Social Security.
Right. Well, let me ask you: Can abortion be called a Holocaust?
Yes, I think it can. I mean. 62 million abortions equals 30% of our entire population under 50. That's a huge number. The casualty rate in World War II was only 1.5% for battle casualties, and 2.5%, including guys who died from training accidents and illness and whatever, or the ships were sunk. But so it's many times what our attrition rate was in World War II. It's 4,000 times as many Americans as have died in the war on terrorism. It's 10 times the number of Jews killed in the Nazi Holocaust. The one that really hits me, though, is it would be equal to 100% casualty rate in a major nuclear attack in our 90 largest cities. 62 million is the population of our 90 largest cities. And in a real nuclear attack, you wouldn't have a 100% casualty rate. It might be down around 30-40% based on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So to get a 100% casualty rate in 90 cities is a major, major loss. But we've already incurred that through abortion. And worldwide, the estimate is close to 2 billion abortions.
Wow.
And that's as many people as were living on the planet in 1927. We're throwing babies away like it didn't matter. Mm-hmm. What we're doing is throwing away our whole future. Your children are your future.
Right.
If you die without children, you disappear as a factor in the economy within, once your estate is settled. That's it. But families who've had children and who go on, their contribution to the economy actually increases with each generation.
Well, when do you think, for instance, I know I've had Star Parker here in studio, and I've had Walter Hoy, who's from the Bay Area, Oakland. They have really tried to get the black population, informed that they have a very high abortion rate and abortion deaths. But it seems like a lot of the black population is rejoicing with Planned Parenthood about having more abortions. How does one counter that, or how does one change that attitude?
Well, for one thing, we need more public knowledge and awareness of it. Smart marketing and selling abortion as some benefit to women is, is a big lie about abortion. I mean, first of all, half of all the abortions are women, so I can't see how that's a benefit to women. Unfortunately, in our era, we have, both some of these lines, hook, line, and sinker, as if they were true. I mean, the first guy who got my attention was Paul Ehrlich, who wrote his book about the population explosion in 1968, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And he predicted disaster. Mass starvation by the 1970s. None of his predictions came true.
Right. I think that someone quoted to me that he had 111 predictions in his book, The Population Bomb. And
that's right.
That did not come true.
Did not come true.
And now, unfortunately, Paul Ehrlich was invited as a guest over to the Vatican, to the Pontifical Academy of Life, which you'd think, that is he is anathema.
Yeah, that's incredible. I really talk about a black mark on the Vatican these days. They're doing some things that are very hard to understand.
How do you turn society around from contraception? I mean, contraception is ubiquitous, and I know that a lot of African countries are rejecting a lot of the contraception that is being forced upon them. How do we here in America?
All right. Well, one of the things we've done is have seminars for teens, for example, and we've had over 1,000 teens come to our seminars. And we take a survey before and after to find out whether the seminar changes their attitudes at all. And it's amazing. Most of our seminars are done through churches, but you'll find that, a very small percentage of even kids from religious homes are 100% pro-life. But what we find by letting them know what the story really is, and it's our typical format is we have a woman who's had experience with abortion and is in recovery, tells her story, and we also were fortunate enough to have Dr. Levitino come to about 5 of them, and he described what it was like to be a young doctor in training for abortion, not realizing that there was anything morally wrong with it. He thought it was something he had to learn as a doctor. And his personal story is quite dramatic. He and his wife, unfortunately, couldn't have children. So here he was aborting other people's children, and he and his wife couldn't have kids. They tried everything to adopt and had great difficulty. And finally, they lucked out. He passed the word through his fellow OBGYNs and let them know he was interested in adopting. And one pro-life teenager who was having a baby wanted to put her up for adoption rather than choosing abortion, mm-hmm. and they were able to adopt her.
Right.
And 5 years went by. He went on performing abortions, and he was doing some of the more egregious
late-term abortions,
midterm abortions. Yeah. And oh, by the way, they had another child 11 months after they adopted this little girl, and his buddies wondered what the heck you're doing, and he's having 2 babies. They didn't know the first one was adopted. But anyhow, when she was 5 years old, they had a birthday party, and they had invited friends over, and there were a bunch of kids playing around the house and running around all over the place, and they heard screeching in front of the house, and there was an accident, and their little girl was hit by a car. And his wife was an emergency room nurse, and he was an OBGYN, and that little girl died in their arms on the way to the hospital. They couldn't save her. And that hit him fairly bad. But he went on doing abortions for a short while.
Right.
But in the middle of an abortion, he got physically ill, and he had great trouble. But he knew he had to finish the abortion, otherwise he'd lose his medical license. So he did, but he told his colleagues no more. And
Dennis, our time has come to an end, and I appreciate all your looking at the big picture from a demographic standpoint and the impact it has on our country and on other countries and on economies and everything else. I wish that it tends to get down to the very personal level, but the big picture has to be looked at from time to time. So we appreciate, Dennis, you're doing that work, and we look forward to seeing you folks next week, and found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching and listening today. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.